Hey everyone, welcome back to the second half of this vloggy type deal. If you missed the first part, you can watch that. I'll put a link down below where I am responding to Erin's video where she talked about 10 films that define you. And so she listed 10 films that she thought defined her and kind of summed her up as a person, and I also gave my 10 films, but being a lifelong gamer, being a mostly games related channel, I felt it was only appropriate that I also talk about 10 games that I think define me in a similar way. So we're going to pick up right where we left off. Again, I own most of these. There are a few that are kind of, I own digital copies or they've only had digital releases, so I'll throw up some screenshots there in lieu of the covers I've been showing. So to start this off, I have a game called Psychic Detective. God, I love long boxes. And this game was originally released for the Panasonic 3DO. I know it might have had a PC release. I know it had a PlayStation 1 release, although that is like a really rare pressing, is a little harder to get than the 3DO copy. And Psychic Detective I'm picking not as much for the game itself, although I actually do like this, but sort of for what it exemplifies. And it's pretty quintessential as far as the whole interactive movie, full motion video craze of the 90s. And it's something that's kind of interesting because you almost, if you talk to people about the history of games, you almost wouldn't know this period happened. But there was like, when CD format games really got big, everyone had CD drives all of a sudden on their game consoles, on their computers. You could store a lot more data on those discs than you could on your traditional carts and floppies and all that. So what happened was developers were kind of looking for ways to show off that additional storage space, and a lot of times this came through, and there are games like Monkey Island, like Star Trek 25th Anniversary was, I think, the first game I experienced where you had the floppy version of the game where it was just text mostly, and then a CD version of the game where they had all this fully voiced audio and all this background music that was totally like orchestrated and not just chiptune music or what have you. And another way that a lot of developers sort of made use of that space was by putting full motion video scenes, or basically live action video cutscenes, into their games. And this is something you still see every once in a while. You see it with the Need for Speed games. I know a couple have still done that more recently. Games like Her Story and Roundabout are some recent releases that make actually pretty good use of FMV. But at the time, it was kind of a weird place, because I think a lot of the people putting it into games, they were game developers first and filmmakers second. And so a lot of times you ended up with really goofy, cheesy stuff. And I think that's what fascinates me about games like this is, I don't know, like at some point, I think because I watched a lot of Mystery Science Theater, I don't know, I developed this interest in things that are seeing things not as they are, but as they could be. And I guess that's kind of what gets me about the full motion video thing, is it's rarely done well, but to me, it's just a really neat concept. And actually, Psychic Detective is not that bad as far as it is more of an interactive movie than a game that is basically the cutscene never really stops. You're just making choices while the video is running that kind of influence what decision the main character makes. And the whole conceit of this is that you are a psychic detective. You're a guy who can hitch a ride on other people's minds and get there, watch everything unfold through their eyes. And as a filmmaker, I think that's really cool. I did a whole academic conference presentation on how we talk about voyeurism in film and the concept of like watching other people and how that appeals to us in film a lot. And I think a lot of FMV games are able to approach voyeurism in this really cool way, where because it's a game, it's a lot more tactile. You're actually interacting, but at the same time, because of the nature of pre-recorded footage, you can only interact so much, and I think that creates some really cool premises. I talked about the film Rear Window as kind of like, if you look at most FMV games have a little bit of Rear Window in their DNA, and that's so weird and yet so neat to talk about. But yeah, that's kind of a roundabout way of talking about why I like Psychic Detective. It's honestly, for an FMV game, it's actually not that bad in terms of production values. It's not the, like, if you just watched it as a film, you might find it wanting, but I think compared to a lot of stuff out there, you know, your Phantasmagorias, your Command and Conquer even, like, it's put together really well, it's presented competently, and again, FMV is just a really neat concept that I'm obsessed with, and so that's kind of why that's an influence on me. The next game is one that I don't think has ever had a physical release. I've actually purchased it twice, once on Steam, one on GOG, because I like it that much, and it's called Jalopy. And Jalopy is a game that basically the premise is you are the child of a Turkish-German family who basically got separated when the Berlin Wall came up. You were born kind of like around that time, and so your parents ended up on one side of the wall, and you and your uncle ended up on the other, and you kind of grew up not ever knowing them, but then all of a sudden the wall goes down in the early 90s, and you're basically taking a road trip with your uncle back to Turkey because you can finally go back and meet these family members you've been separated from for years. And the hitch in this is that your uncle is a technician for a car called a Leica, and if you're familiar with real life history, the Leica is based off the Trabant, which was an East German car that was kind of awful in a lot of ways. It was actually, when it came out, it was built in the 50s or 60s, and it wasn't great, but it wasn't awful. The trick being that they pretty much only ever produced that kind of car until some point in the 90s. It's a very deliberately, like, you know, cheap, crappy Soviet car that Trabants are known for being very high maintenance, and the Leica is very high maintenance. It breaks down every few miles, so you're constantly scavenging for parts, going to, if you see like a junkyard on the side of the road or another broken car on the side of the road, you're always like looking for engine pieces to swap out and kind of just barely keep this thing running that is pretty much on the verge of breaking at all times. And it's just a really cool game in terms of, I think that the keeping the car repaired element is very fun, but also people use in movies, they use the term pure cinema a lot, and I think Jalopy is a good example of pure gaming in terms of narrative, because it's all about the kind of experience of taking this journey, of going somewhere and sort of being the feel of taking this journey someplace you've never been and kind of wondering what's going to come next. That's kind of accented by the way you, not only do you not know what's going to happen to your car, but each country is randomly generated. There's a set path I think you go through. It's set in the 90s, so you go through the CSFR and like down to Yugoslavia until you're finally in Turkey. But each country kind of has its own ambiance and its own feel, and so it creates this very interesting experience and kind of story of going to see, like, you know, going to see this family you've been separated from without ever really having any dialogue or any cutscenes. Your uncle does talk to you a little bit, but that's very, very minor, and you can play the game without him, and it's still this really great atmospheric experience. And I think as someone who's become interested in German history and culture, especially that kind of post-wall stuff, is something that I never really had heard about, and it's kind of really interesting to me now. So that's kind of how that game speaks to me in those ways. Moving on to a very different type of game. I actually wanted to talk about Half-Life 2, but I have the box for this one. So honestly, I don't think you can talk about one without talking about, or Half-Life 2 without talking about Half-Life 1. And I think it defined me not only just because I played it a lot. Actually, I was very late to the game. I think I picked up my copy in like 2008 or so, like right before high school, but I think Half-Life 2 was already out by that point. But I think that's kind of a testament to how well Half-Life has held up, because not only is it's designed very well, you have this really great kind of progression. It was one of the first, not necessarily the first, but one of the early first-person shooters to have a narrative tying it together, and I think Half-Life 2 was a lot stronger in the narrative department. But the first game was very interesting in just you didn't see that a lot in games. So the fact that they were doing that at all was cool. And I think, honestly, I think the first-person shooter genre kind of peaked at that point, because it was kind of a balance where you still had really good gameplay and focus on that, but you also had these cool scripted moments that didn't get obtrusive like they do, or like they have in a lot of recent games. And the last couple years, I think, have seen kind of a return to the classic first-person shooter with games like Dusk and Ion Maiden and stuff like that. Yeah, Half-Life was a really big influence on me because of it introduced me to the whole concept of like a real virtual world that you interacted with. Like, it didn't just feel like a level. It felt like you were wandering through this facility and these, this section, like the freezer section or the labs or whatever, and it felt like a real place that I was kind of learning about and figuring out. And that's something I've grown to appreciate and focus on in games when I play them. So, talking about that is another game that did have a physical release, but again, I own it through Steam, I think. And that is Space Quest V. And I could, point and clicks are a whole rabbit hole for me. I could talk about that genre for a while. And I picked out Space Quest because it's a series that really, again, kind of like I talked about Kung Pao and Wayne's World, it's very rare that you see a game that kind of clicks with my sense of humor. And humor in games is something that's not done an awful lot, and it's very rarely done well. And Space Quest as a series really stuck out to me as a game that had some great humor moments, and it leans a lot on parody. And especially that's interesting now, because a lot of it is parody of stuff that you won't really be familiar with unless you're like up on all the games of the time, or if you were playing games at the time they came out in like the late 80s, early 90s. But again, it's just one of the few games that kind of consistently made me laugh with the touches they introduce. And Space Quest V specifically is, I think, one of the best, short of Galaxy Quest, is probably one of the best Star Trek parodies out there. You have this whole thing where you're flying a garbage scow, and that's this whole lead up to the fact that you get in a fight because someone called your ship a garbage scow, which is a Star Trek reference, except this time it actually is, but you still get in a fight. Stuff like that. It's kind of hard to. There's a lot of moments that don't really come to mind, but I think they all come together as a whole. And also the Space Quest series, I think it manages to have just enough of a story to keep you invested in what happens. I played Space Quest 1 through 6, I think over a weekend. I just kind of marathon sessioned the entire series, and I was immediately ready for more. And I think that is kind of a testament to what these games can do, because they also have that space element where you are exploring and charting out unknown planets and all that. And even though that's not the main focus of the game, it just all comes together really well. And I think that's I guess it means a lot to me in terms of reminding you that you can do something really cool and still have a sense of humor about it. That's, again, something you don't see a lot in games, so that's something I've always admired. For this next game, we're going way back, and this is Marathon. Marathon 2 specifically is probably the one I played the most as a kid, and this is a game I would watch my dad play back in the early days of the 90s. And it also ties into something that has kind of defined me in a deeper level, and that is Mac games. Growing up, we didn't have a Windows computer, we had a Mac, and so there were all these games that I played that Windows gamers never grew up with, so I'm one of the handful of people who remembers this stuff. And Marathon, I think, is a good example, because at the time it was the pride and joy of Mac gamers. If any PC person was like, oh, we've got Doom, we've got all this, the Mac person could be like, yeah, but you don't have Marathon. And that's a whole other rabbit hole again. Yeah, Marathon had a big influence on me just because it introduced me to so much, because it was one of the first games I really saw and processed when I was little, and it really got me into retro first-person shooters. That's a genre I still love and talk about a lot. And it also it predates Half-Life as being a game that was tied together by a narrative. You have every level you have these kind of wall terminals that I think Unreal kind of did a similar thing, but Marathon would have these wall terminals with text messages that you get from different people and different AIs on the ship that are talking to you, and it all comes together in this it's really well written, I think. And that's really how Marathon influenced me, because I remember going onto the Marathon story page where people would discuss, the terminals, and there was they went so deep into stuff, talking about like all these references to Lovecraft, or the fact that these 3 levels, if you put their acronym together, it means this, or this one terminal has a bunch of like hexadecimal code, and if you copy paste it into a hex editor and then compile it, you get a new multiplayer level, or just this really interesting kind of, I don't know, brainy stuff. And I think that experience had a pretty huge impact on me, just getting me into the idea of analysis and of looking at things in kind of a deeper manner, and kind of breaking fiction and breaking art down. And that's what I'm doing right now. So that kind of all started with Marathon, I think, and so that's why that game is so big to me. On a different note, I would say Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, the whole series, is one of my favorite game series, but I picked 2 because I've probably spent the most time playing Tony Hawk 2, and I think it's the game that kind of really hammered home the importance of just pure gameplay to me, because it's not a game. Later in like the Tony Hawk's Underground series, you had like this whole plot of like Team Tony and Team Bam and all this stuff, but in the early games it was really just about pure gameplay and making that the fun of what you were doing. And that's something that I think a lot of games kind of overshoot, or at least the games that don't end up being as good kind of overshoot that really simple thing of, does doing this action feel cool? And that's something I think the Tony Hawk games really exemplified, and something that I think they kind of lost when Skate came out. It was a game that was focused on really realistic skating, and I think the Tony Hawk games were like, oh, everyone wants realism in their skating, when I think their appeal was always that they were kind of over the top and crazy, and you could like hit a ramp and go 5 million miles in the air and play as a zombie and all this crazy stuff. And also Tony Hawk games, kind of the Tony Hawk series, kind of really influenced my music taste, and I'm far from the only person, I think, who has had that experience. But aside from just getting me into punk music, and like I'm not a huge rap music fan, but some of the Tony Hawk games did kind of open that door by introducing me to certain artists and things, and it just kind of hammered home the importance of music. Music is something that's really important to me, and in a way I haven't entirely processed yet, but yeah, it's just something that, like I said, I haven't entirely processed it yet. Yeah, just sort of, I don't know, gives you something to, some kind of extra undercurrent. But yeah, Tony Hawk had a really huge influence on my music taste, so that's why that's on this list. Next we have, again, the whole series could count, but Tomb Raider: The Last Revelation here. I think I've loved pretty much every Tomb Raider game from the original PS1 game up through like Tomb Raider Underworld. The new games are alright, but they're hashtag not my Tomb Raider. I think what the original Tomb Raider games are really kind of one of the first games I thought of in terms of like design. If you start playing the games, you kind of realize that everything is sort of arranged on this grid, and you can kind of start looking at it in terms of the game world, but also in terms of kind of how it was designed. And I think that's a big thing. I'm, as someone who cares about games as a medium and as an industry, that learning to process games in terms of design was a big moment for me. And also, they're just really fun games in terms of exploration, because that's something else that I've become really, really passionate about and really focused on in terms of what games I like, is the games that create a world for you to explore and for you to go out and see into this crazy place and see what the heck's going on and find all this stuff. And I feel like I could spend a while going deeper on that, but again, Tomb Raider is where that seed first got kind of planted and kind of set the bar, I guess, for kind of what I expect or want from pretty much any game I've played since. Now, I mentioned when I was talking about Marathon that Mac games were kind of a big thing for me growing up, and I wanted to talk about another one that I don't think ever had a physical release, and that was the Escape Velocity series, made by Ambrosia Software. If you've played games on a Mac, you've probably seen at least one Ambrosia game. They've done a lot of sort of arcade ports. They did like Centipede and Asteroids clones and all that. And Escape Velocity was kind of interesting because it was, I guess it's a lot like the game Freelancer or Elite or Frontier by extension, but I didn't really experience those games until much later in life, whereas Escape Velocity I started playing probably around age like 10 or 12 or so. And it just really, it's sort of a space exploration game where there is a narrative you can follow, but you can also just fly around gaining more money, being like a space trucker, shipping goods from place to place, or you can be a mercenary or a pirate or pretty much whatever you want. And at the time, like I said, I'd never played Freelancer or anything like that, and Escape Velocity really it was just really cool immersing myself in kind of the life of a space trucker, as you will. And that's always been, I'd say film is kind of my secondary dream, because being a starship pilot isn't a viable career yet. But yeah, I think it was kind of the first time I'd ever really gotten into the concept of like and it's pretty arcade-like in terms of controls and all that. It's like a top-down kind of game, but in terms of simulating the life experience of someone and just kind of putting myself in that role. It was a pretty influential game on me. Like from that point forward, I would read, sci-fi novels about like starship pilots or whatever, and I would be like, that's me. Those are my people, because I played those games. So that like it's something that's still very formative or very important to me. It's just the concept of like space, and like I mentioned with Space Quest, exploring kind of the unknown frontiers, and that's I don't exactly know what outlets I found for that in my current life, but it is like that kind of curiosity for the unknown and for adventure is something that like that sounds incredibly cheesy, I just realized, but that is something that's always been kind of a big part of me and kind of what I want out of life, I guess. And just a fascination with space in general, I suppose, I also kind of got from that. So, Escape Velocity. Also, there was Escape Velocity Override, and Escape Velocity Nova, which came out later on, like, OS X and stuff, and I didn't play as much. Override is the one I spent the most time on, and if you're astute, you may notice that the game gets abbreviated EV Override, which may have inspired the name of something. So moving on, I said I wouldn't talk about Star Wars movies, but Star Wars games have been a huge impact on me. I'd say I kind of grew up in the expanded universe, and Knights of the Old Republic, specifically Knights of the Old Republic 2, again, a really big formative experience. Knights of the Old Republic 1 is probably technically the better game, but I think 2 had more influence on me as a person. So I grew up reading lots of Star Wars novels, and being a Jedi was always my dream as a kid. And again, like, I know I'm not even close to being alone in that. And Knights of the Old Republic was the first game that kind of gave me a chance to live out that fantasy of being a Jedi, and not just exploring the galaxy, but being this kind of sort of applying the philosophy of the Force, because that was something I got really into as a kid. Growing up in a church household, moral codes and spirituality was a big thing, and then Star Wars kind of gave me a way to, it sort of made that cool, I guess. Got me into this whole idea of having the code of honor and applying philosophy and being the honorable warrior and all that. And Knights of the Old Republic was, you know, put that into an actual experience I could play. So already it was a big thing for me. But then the way the second game especially kind of talked about ethics, because typically in Star Wars things are very cut and dry. You know, you have the dark side and the light side. There's very little in between most of the time. And Knights of the Old Republic kind of delved more into the concept. I think they'd been already established in like some comics, but the idea of gray Jedi who weren't Sith and didn't live for cruelty, but they also felt like just holding yourself to the rigid code of the light side was, you know, too dogmatic and limited you, and kind of the history of the Star Wars universe kind of supports that. But there are several moments in the second game that kind of, it was one of the early games to kind of give you that whole moral choice mechanic. Like, you could choose to be good, you could choose to be bad. I had never played a game like that. I know there were a couple games that kind of did that before, but I think even at this early point, they were already kind of playing with that, because there are moments where you make a choice and you get light side points for it, and then someone says, you weren't doing that because you're a good guy or because you care about anyone, you're doing it so you feel better about yourself. So, like, are you even a good guy at all, or are you just, you know, doing the things because you know those are the light side things? And in retrospect, I think there are probably games that have played with that more since, but I think that was, again, the first time I'd ever encountered anything like that, and it really, I don't think I've ever played a game that kind of made me think about the implications of my actions as actions rather than just as this kind of binary choice, even though the game did kind of reduce things to a binary a lot. So Knights of the Old Republic was a big game to me for that reason, and that whole concept of choice leads me into another game that kind of carried the same idea. And this was, I only have the CD because that's what happens when you buy games at thrift stores, but Deus Ex, the original, get focus on that, was, not only was it really big, I played it, I think my sophomore year of high school, that would have been 2010, 9 or 10. I was a little late to the party on that. Deus Ex came out in 2001, but that was really when I was getting into cyberpunk, when I was getting into Shadowrun, reading all these William Gibson novels. So Deus Ex really kind of kick-started that interest, but also just the concept of kind of being, it's all about conspiracies and about, you know, government conspiracies and sort of political ideals and stuff, and it gets, I think at times it can be a little shallow. Like, there's a conversation with this Hong Kong bartender where you're both just kind of throwing out buzzwords and nothing actually really means anything, but there are a lot of other moments that, again, Deus Ex was, I played Knights of the Old Republic at this point, and Deus Ex was a game that gave you all these choices, but it didn't tell you this is the good choice, this is the bad choice. You had to kind of do stuff and live with your actions, and you might not learn until several levels later what the full ramifications of that choice you just made really were. And that's something that I think really impacted me as, you know, a young teenage kid. Just really getting me into the concept of analyzing kind of ethics more, just thinking less in terms of X is good, Y is bad, but, you know, asking, okay, why am I doing this? What do I accomplish by helping this person or by not helping this person? Because there are times, you know, in real life, but there are times, like in the game, there's someone who's, you know, suffering intense pain because of drug withdrawals, and you can help this person. You know, this person's in pain. Do you want to give them drugs, and, you know, they'll probably help you because of that, or do you want to, you know, deny them and you're, you know, turn down this reward that would really help you because you know it's going to be better for them in the long run? And just those kind of decisions, and also just kind of skepticism in general. It was one of the first games that has one of those espionage plot lines where you're not really sure who to trust, and sometimes you end up being asked to make these decisions, and you have the choice whether you want to follow through or whether you want to be like, you know, maybe I don't want to play for this team anymore. And it was just, again, at the time, at this, you know, high school was still a very formative stage relative to where I am now. And at the time, I was still a person who thought very very in terms of that whole, X good, Y bad binary thing. And just playing a game that made me really think about things in a more complex manner was pretty big at the time. I remember it also, it's the game I say almost kept me out of college, because I very nearly forgot to finish all my college applications because I was so immersed in this game. And it's another game that world building was such a huge thing, because there's these environments with these people, and it's a 10-year-old game. It's kind of showing its age, especially if you compare it to like even newer Deus Ex games like Human Revolution. But the environments were still just places that feel like real places. You can go in and talk to all these people, and kind of has almost a more RPG feel. And it was just something that was so immersive and got me. I think that really helped the impact of some of the decisions you had to make. I was so immersed in this world, and I was like, well, I don't want to do this because, I like these guys and that's going to make them mad at me, but can I really do this because it would, it doesn't fit with my moral framework and all this stuff. And so it really, like I said, it could be shallow at times, but overall I think it was a game that really made me think in ways I'd never been made to think before. And I think that had a pretty huge impact on me, and that's kind of why it's sort of the last one I wanted to talk about. So I hope all of that has kind of been fun, maybe giving you some insights into why the heck I am the way I am. I know it was a lot of fun sort of delving into these memories and these games and movies that I really like. So yeah, let me know in the comments what are some of your favorite games, what games have had an impact on you in your life. Also, please like, subscribe if you feel like it. Please give me comments, let me know what you like and don't like, so I can make better videos in the future. And in the meantime, thanks for joining me, and I will see you later.